The Armory Show was the first American exhibition of European modern art. It opened at an unused National Guard armory on Lexington Avenue in New York on February 17, 1913. It was up for 30 days, then traveled to Chicago and Boston. It introduced Americans to the latest styles of modernism, such as cubism, fauvism, and futurism. It generated unprecedented controversy. The arguments about modern art and literature went on for years, and to a great extent, they never stopped. That show is especially remembered for what was said about certain artworks, especially Marcel Duchamp's painting titled Nude Descending a Staircase. His painting was described by one critic as an explosion in a shingle factory, while it was also portrayed in a famous cartoon of the New York subway at rush hour called The Rude Descending a Staircase. Former U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt condemned the exhibition as the output of the lunatic fringe. The Armory Show was still on view on March 3, 1913, the day before the inauguration of President Woodrow Wilson, when thousands of women's rights advocates marched down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., using the same parade route that the president used the following day. They were marching in protest of, among other issues, the denial of women the right to vote. There was more than a timely alliance between the Armory Show and the March for Women's Rights. Surely most Americans then were offended by any suggestion that women were somehow equal to men. That idea was as foreign to them as the hideous malformations of modern art. The public had long been accustomed to realistic representational art. Earlier, they had lampooned the male proponents of the aesthetic movement, a trend that had been energized by Japanese woodcuts and decorative arts. Artists and writers such as James McNeill Whistler, Oscar Wilde, and Aubrey Beardsley were dismissed as preening peacocks who, by squandering virility for beauty, were diluting the rough and ready of men. At a time when women were not permitted to vote, they were also not allowed to serve in the military. When World War I broke out in Europe in 1914, the U.S. remained neutral. It was only 3 years later, in 1917, that it declared war against Germany, partly in delayed response to the sinking of the RMS Lusitania by U-boats, in which 128 Americans died. In the technology of World War I, the old and new met head-to-head. Bicycles and horses were still being used for wartime transportation, as were early motor cars and strange experimental tanks. Carrier pigeons were commonly used to convey messages on the battlefield. Armed with rifles, bayonets, and grenades, soldiers sprang over the top of the trenches to rush suicidally into barbed wire and devastating machine gun fire. Perhaps the most dreadful adoptions were the use of poison gas and the targeting of enemy troops by enormous shell-shock cannons whose terrifying noise and collateral destructiveness were otherworldly at best. Among the war's odd innovations was the widespread implementation of camouflage. The practice of deception predates human history, but this war was the first in which an official camouflage section was set up for the purpose of ensuring its effective use. Before the war, The French word camouflage had mostly been used to refer to disguises worn by criminals or to costumes used by actors. It was not until late 1914 or early 1915, when the French army established its first camouflage workshop, that camouflage became the term for hoodwinking the eyes of the opposite side. Although women could not serve as infantry, they became involved in other ways. French women had the earliest opportunities to contribute to camouflage as a result of innovations by French artists in the army who were serving on the front and who were attached to an artillery unit. Of the French camouflage artists, the one who is usually cited as its key originator was Lucien Victor Guérin de Savola, a 43-year-old academic painter who was serving as a go-between for headquarters and front-line artillery teams. Although he once suggested that French camouflage was influenced by Cubism, his own art could hardly be further from avant-garde. Guérin de Savola was among the first to realize that the positions of artillery teams were being disclosed to the enemy's long-range guns by aerial observers. He was not alone in noticing this, and by late 1914, he began to work with several others who were associated with Art Nouveau, among them Eugène Corbin and Louis Guingot. Soon, an official camouflage section was formed. It was the recommendation of the first camouflage artists that the French artillery teams should make their locations all but invisible from the air. As a result, members of that unit began to dress in paint-streaked robes. These were hooded, shapeless coveralls with surfaces stained by splattered paint. When viewed close up, they were sinister and menacing, like a darker, sordid version of the costumes of the Ku Klux Klan. These outfits were formally known as cagoules. These French artist soldiers also coated the cannons with disruptive painted patterns or covered them with paint-splattered canvas to decrease reflection from the sun and to make them hard to single out as discrete entities from a distant aerial view. The styles of these aerial camouflage patterns appear to have varied widely. From surviving paintings and photographs, some were brightly colored, while the colors of others were more subdued. Still others made use of sharply outlined, colored forms that resembled meaningless abstract shapes, like the backs of jigsaw puzzle parts. The French public was initially disturbed by the change of outfits for these artillerymen, whose traditional colorful uniforms were so abruptly replaced, as an art historian later said, by an amorphous costume of drab greens and browns that turned the individual into a frightening form. It must have been equally troubling when this practice of fooling the enemy's eyes became known as camouflage, while the soldiers who practiced deceptions were called camoufleurs. In the past, to fight for one's country had been an honorable, heroic act, but the French word camouflage had been used in reference to deception in the underworld, to the use of deceit and dishonesty for illicit purposes. In 1911, 3 years before the war broke out, a fictional criminal character named Fantomas began to appear in crime novels in France. Looking back on film versions of that character, he wears a dark, hooded outfit that resembles a camoufleur's sinister cloak. Oddly, this is also how women began to be seen as practitioners of camouflage. Already under suspicion for suggesting that they, as females, were equivalent to men, women were increasingly said to have been experts at camouflage, at fooling the eyes of susceptible males, back to the Garden of Eden and since. Throughout human history, it was claimed, women had taken advantage of men. They had typically altered their physical form through cosmetics, hair dyes, clothing fashions, and special effects. They had resorted to fraudulent methods to look younger, more attractive, more desirable in size and proportion. They had cunningly used their emotions by pretending to be tearful whenever that worked in their favor. "Half of the art of being a woman," said one writer at the time, "is camouflage. They've been doing it all their lives." Another wrote, "What a woman can do with rouge and powder passes all understanding. It is camouflage carried to a fine art." In Europe, early in the war, women contributed to military camouflage, if in a somewhat limited sense. At the time, there was no industrial way of producing paint-stained fabric. French civilian women were hired to work at wartime production centers, where they used broom-like brushes to discolor enormous lengths of canvas, which were then suspended on racks to dry. They were still doing this in 1918, when the American Camouflage Corps, the U.S. by then having entered the war, arrived to work together with them. They are shown here mixing paint. Back in the U.S., now fighting on the Allies' side, there was no shortage of joking about the capabilities of women as camoufleurs, or as they were derisively called, camoufleuses or camoufleuses. In a cartoonist tongue-in-cheek challenge to the exclusion of women from military service, a question in the headline asked, "A free tip for the Army. Why not try women camoufleurs?" At last, in 1918, that suggestion was taken up, if in a somewhat roundabout way. A group of civilian American women, some of whom were artists, established what was officially known as the Women's Reserve Camouflage Corps. Members of this unit were trained in camouflage practices at several recreational parks in the vicinity of New York City. Shown here in the center is the male officer who served as their instructor, Lieutenant Ledyard Towle, an artist and architect, at a gathering of the participants in the course. On the ground, directly right of Towle, is a wooden box painted to blend in with the stone wall behind it. Gender stereotypes prevailed. From the outset, it was assumed that women camoufleurs had a natural aptitude for clothing construction and sewing. As part of their training, they were assigned to design and construct hooded camouflage robes to blend in with the natural surroundings. Shown here is a demonstration by another officer of a comparable camouflage robe. Having completed their own disguises, the women camoufleurs put them on, then posed in park surroundings, with the robe's effectiveness being confirmed by these on-site photographs. Their training was not limited to camouflage. It also included familiarity with firearms, as seen here on a rifle range. They were also introduced to boxing and other combat fundamentals. At the time, the women's camouflage training was an irresistible subject for satirists and pundits, and, for the public, an inevitable source of amusement. There was no shortage of newspaper and magazine features, as seen here in the Boston Post. This particular article states that after completing their training, the women have asked to be shipped to France. But in fact, that did not actually happen, because this article was published in early August 1918, and the war in Europe ended on November 11th. Their training was not limited to ground camouflage, in which emphasis tends to be on the blending of figures with backgrounds. They were also introduced to naval camouflage, as shown in this photograph, in which they are drawing a ship in the river below. In the finished drawings, they were expected to include their proposals for camouflage schemes. The experience of the Women's Reserve Camouflage Corps with ship camouflage was broadened in July 1918 when an unusual opportunity arose. In the hope of attracting male recruits, the American Navy had built a wooden recruiting station in the bustling center of Union Square in New York City. To attract crowds and to heighten curiosity, the station was made to resemble a ship. It was christened the USS Recruit. Given the public's fascination with camouflage, it was decided that even greater attention would come from painting the wooden ship with brightly colored camouflage patterns. The final pattern was designed, of course, by a male camouflage artist. But the publicity stunt was perfected when the Women's Reserve Camouflage Corps was asked to apply the camouflage to the ship in a single day. The attention this attracted was almost unprecedented, as newspapers reported in detail the process of the painting, the novelty of watching the women carry this out, and, last but not least, the bewildering modernist camouflage scheme. It was typical of an approach to ship camouflage, which the British had developed, called dazzle or dazzle painting. It did not attempt to blend figure and surroundings through high similarity, but it was instead a high difference plan. The goal of such camouflage patterns was not to hide the vessel, but to undermine the accuracy of the U-boat gunner who was submerged in active waters and peering for less than a minute from a distance through a periscope in weather that may have been less than ideal. One of the consequences of dazzle painting a landlocked, ship-shaped building was that recruiters and fundraisers quickly found that the mere act of applying a colorful dazzle design to virtually anything would attract attention and increase attendance at events. Soon after, the Women's Camouflage Corps were asked to camouflage the widest range of things, such as a transport bus featured in a Liberty Loan fundraising campaign, a disruptively camouflaged tank that was parked temporarily in front of the New York Public Library to promote tank corps recruitment, and an Air Corps service vehicle. In 1918, some tangible progress was achieved with regard to women's eligibility for military service. Because of the lack of precision in the wording of a congressional bill, in which future Navy personnel were ambiguously referred to as persons rather than men, the Secretary of the Navy decided, given a personnel shortage, that men and women should both be allowed to serve. As a result, it became possible for women to enlist in the Navy and, in various capacities, to participate directly in naval camouflage. Among the units that welcomed the so-called yeomanettes was the Navy's camouflage section, in which there were two branches, one in Washington, D.C., staffed by artists, and a second at the Eastman Kodak Research Park in Rochester, New York, where science-based research took place. There are surviving government photographs that document the activities of the women in the camouflage section. This was not without precedent. In 1917 in London, after dazzle camouflage had been adopted by the British Admiralty, A British artist named Norman Wilkinson, whose painting of the Lusitania we saw earlier, was allowed to set up a camouflage production space at Burlington House, where the Royal Academy of Arts is housed. There were a few men artists on his staff, but the majority of Wilkinson's camouflage workers were young women art students. Meanwhile, teams of men were given the task of painting the actual ships in the docks. The French Navy soon followed the British example, and, in turn, the U.S. government invited Wilkinson to visit its East Coast harbors to meet with American ship camoufleurs. In the brief remaining months of the war, disruptive camouflage designs were devised, tested, and applied to more than 5,200 British and American ships. As the war came to a close, restrictions on information were eased, beginning in 1918 and continuing into the following year. There were a growing number of dance hall celebrations, masquerades, and other fundraising festivities that were advertised as camouflage balls. The most elaborate may have been the Dazzle Ball that was held by the Chelsea Arts Club at Royal Albert Hall in London in March of 1919. Among those who created the settings, props, and costumes were Norman Wilkinson and 3 others from his camouflage team. Against a musical setting of jazz, as one news source reported, the ballroom looked convincingly like a gigantic fleet with war paint on. Wilkinson and his colleagues were hailed as those who could make a dreadnought look like a nude descending a staircase. At the same time, that news article also warned that this, quote, new and dazzling guise may cause collisions in the ballroom as it did on the sea. In these days, when dancers do the 1-step, 2-step, 3-step, and on up to 8 steps simultaneously to the same tune, it is becoming difficult to keep the necessary leeway and seaway. When a ship or a woman is disguised by dazzle decoration, one is likely to be more than 15 points off in judging her course. Inevitably, the growing dazzle camouflage craze was contagiously transmitted from ballroom costumes to civilian fashion design. In mid-June of 1919, it was reported that on a beach at Margate, England, 3 women were observed in scandalous dazzle-patterned bathing suits. Other sightings were observed at Brighton and a spa at Bath. A week later, the first examples of dazzle swimsuits showed up at Coney Island. It is expected, the newspaper said, that the new fad will be highly developed before the season is over. At Coney Island, the beach patrol became unnerved. The day before, they had issued 14 summons for women whose suits, as judged by patrolmen, were too revealing. The suggestion was made, the newspaper said, that camouflage might be perfected to the point where it would hide offenders from the eagle-eyed Coney Island police. The challenge, as has always been, of finding the functional balance between display and concealment was summed up in a poetic conversation between a young girl and her mother about bathing suits and camouflage. "Oh, mother, may I go down and swim?" "Oh, yes, my darling daughter, but your bathing suit's so awfully scant. You must stay in deep water." "Oh, camouflage will remedy that," the maiden laughed in glee. "No one will notice my bathing suit after it's made them notice me." There is a strangely mixed postscript to this. At the end of World War I, male camouflage artists, who had been lauded during the war, frequently found it a challenge to return to their earlier livelihoods as professional artists. Spurred on by the Armory Show, the galleries had shifted to Modernist styles, and art produced before the war was outmoded and devalued. It was widely claimed by others that Cubists, Futurists, and Vortices had somehow authored camouflage, but most of the camouflage artists had not been Modernists before the war, and now that their service had ended, they could not come to believe in, nor could they adapt to, those unfamiliar styles of art. There was a surprising exception. It was Lieutenant Ledyard Towle, who had been the instructor for the Women's Reserve Camouflage Corps. At war's end, he too had found it difficult to return to his life as a studio artist. But in time, he found a position with an advertising agency, where he was responsible for the account of the DuPont Company. In subsequent years, he worked as a top-level corporate colorist for DuPont, General Motors, and Pittsburgh Paint and Glass. To put it simply, unlike other now civilian camoufleurs, Towle chose not to abandon his wartime skills, but instead to repackage them as reverse camouflage. While teaching camouflage during the war, he had become disenchanted with the art world. He turned instead to industrial design, where, as he described it, he could use color with a purpose. He became the first and foremost color engineer, an expert on the selection and use of colors in the widest range of products: automobiles, furniture, appliances, fixtures, and interior walls. To his credit, his use of camouflage in reverse, display combined with concealment, contributed to the safety of workers while also increasing production and sales. 10 years after the end of the war, he was described in a magazine article as a pioneer in the movement that has brought lavender tea boxes, turquoise alarm clocks, and a host of vivid motor cars. The aesthetic movement had survived.